And so in essence, we're moving, as you notice, constantly back and forward in time. This session ostensibly now is about the present moment, extreme and not extreme, and in particular, the worlds of contemporary art, which one could also include modern art in that, or even historical art, but the role of various institutions, actors and agents in the art world today, and also independent cinema. And so my two guests to my right are Munira Al Sayegh. She's a curator. She sits on the advisory council board of the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery. She previously worked as programs officer for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi between 2015 and 17. She's curated the Abu Dhabi Art Talks program in 2017 and co-curated Art Dubai projects in 2014. Butheina Kazim is the founder of Cinema Akil, programming repertory cinema programs across the UAE. I always have trouble with repertory. Repertory, I have to practice that. Cinema Akil is a member of the network of Arab alternative screens and is the only art house cinema in the Gulf region. This is a really important point, and I hope we're going to discuss this more. Butheina lives and works in Dubai. So before I hand over to Munira, so we're going to have short presentations from them both. I asked for a series of trigger talking points that, again, situate us in this kind of broader sweep of time and space, but importantly bring us right up to where we are today. And then we'll have a conversation between us. So will you please join me in welcoming Munira and Butheina? Thank you very much.
Could we get the other PowerPoint up, please?
Yeah, could we have Munira's up first?
I'd like to take this moment to thank everybody for being here. It's been an honor and a privilege to be amongst everybody that has been on the stage. And with that said, I'm looking at a specific focus within contemporary art. I'm starting to look at the idea of community and the essence of community in understanding the truth of the overall arts ecosystem in the UAE. So I will begin by looking at the 70s and slowly work my way up to the present with focusing in on 2007 as a moment of catalyst for change. So since I have this ready here, I'm going to read it out to you guys. Community sits at the core of contemporary art history and the introduction of conceptual thinking in the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates has been put on the map for contemporary art in recent years for its mega projects, but contemporary art and conceptual thinking formally began to appear in the United Arab Emirates from the 1980s. And informally, you can see the beginnings of this thinking in the 1970s. During this talk, I will highlight community as a central and pivotal aspect of the overall arts ecosystem. I will be dividing the talk into three main categories, starting with the 1980s and the understanding of the late Hassan Sharif as a catalyst towards the creation of the base of contemporary art in the UAE and his influences regionally. And from that, I will be looking at the support given early on to the group of practicing artists by the Emirates Fine Arts Society and the Sharjah Art Museum in the late 80s through the 90s, which then brings us to the moment where the Sharjah Biennial came to be. Secondly, I'll be looking at the shift in narrative that took place in 2007 with the announcements for the future museums of Abu Dhabi Saadiyat Cultural District and the introduction of the art fair as a platform through the launch of Art Dubai, and then soon after in 2009, the first pavilion at the Venice Biennial. The third chapter of this talk will finally bring us back to the present that seeks to return to grassroots establishments and re-highlight the necessity of community. Hassan Sharif, I'm sure most of you have heard of him, was an essential part of the establishment of the conceptual movement in the United Arab Emirates. Upon his return from his undergraduate degree at the Bayam Shah School of Art, which is now part of Central St. Martin's, he found his sanctuary amongst the company of other artists, writers, and intellectuals. During the late 70s and the early 80s, after the establishment of the UAE, a creative subculture began to emerge. From radical, formal, and conceptual experimentation in both art and writing. Hassan's home in the neighborhood of Satwa in Dubai quickly became the nucleus for exchange, dialogue, and critique. This house later became the inspiration for the short-lived flying house in Al Goz debate. Frequenting the house in Satwa were the likes of Muhammad Kazim, one of Hassan Sharif's students and most notable artists from the UAE, Hussein Sharif, his brother and artist, Ahmed Rashid Thani, an eminent poet, Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim, a land artist, Abdullah Sa'di, a conceptual artist, and Adil Khuzam, a poet and writer. Later in their careers, this group was showcased together and exhibited as a group. This is actually the first exhibition that took place in the Emirates Fine Arts Society in 1981. And this is the creation of many meetings that came together. One of my favorite aspects between this group and this collective of artists was their monthly meetings. It was an informal monthly meeting that took place on a sand dune between Ajman and Sharjah. This location in Arabic they called Qal'at al-Raml, which translates to the sand palace. And as you were passing the space, if you saw a fire burning, a bonfire burning, you knew that the space would be activated. This informal space was malleable enough to host various forms of gatherings, from Hassan Sharif's sharing of his translated academic and theoretical texts about contemporary and conceptual art, to a poet maybe sharing his or her poetry, or to heated debates instigated by the intellectuals that were attended there. The lack of definition of this space allowed it to become whatever it needed to be at this time. And on the other hand, more structured foundations, such as Emirates Fine Arts Society, founded in 1980, and Sharjah Art Museum, and then later the Sharjah Biennial in the 1990s, became the pioneers for public spaces in the United Arab Emirates for experimental art. Sharjah became the main anchor for the group of artists to express and showcase their work, which usually led to heated aesthetic debates and controversy. Again, this is the first exhibition that took place in 1981 at the Emirates Fine Arts Society in Sharjah, and it showcased many of the groups, the members of the initial conceptual group. In the 1990s came an addition, like a resurgence of new artists into the house in Satwa. You had Jos Clevers, who was a Dutch artist and curator, and Vivek Vilsani, an artist who migrated from Bombay, and Ibtisam Abdulaziz, who was a mathematician in practice, turned artist, joined this group and began to showcase their work alongside them. As an effort to educate and document, the wider group would publish in newspapers, and they started a homegrown magazine named Tashkeel. This is just them hanging out. Here, Tashkeel. That helped further build the audience and solidify and contextualize the artwork being produced amongst the creatives. So this is one of the main documents that really gives us a moment of that time, the 70s and the 80s, and the ideas that they were thinking about conceptually, and how they also tied back to each other. They really established their own history and their own narrative through having a platform like this to produce in. From that, we move quite drastically into the 2000s. This is Sharjah Art Foundation, where you have the kind of mix and match of architecture of the old houses and then the new spaces in between that mimic the old homes. And this is where the biennial took place, and you would have them sort of scattered in between these spaces, which allowed for a wider audience to participate and view the artwork. Now, in 2007, we have what I call the new wave of contemporary art in the United Arab Emirates, which is when the UAE was put on the map internationally. Abu Dhabi announced its ambitious Saadiyat Cultural District project, which planned for the opening of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and the Zayed National Museum. And Dubai launched the region's first international art fair in that same year. Through these institutions, a new platform for structured programming and the idea of the formal institution began to evolve the overall arts infrastructure and further began to shape the role of cultural diplomacy in the United Arab Emirates. After the launch of Art Dubai, Dubai quickly became the main commercial hub for the region within the arts. Galleries were being established in the 2000s in Dubai's International Financial Center, the IFC, and in Al Goz, where the start of Al Sarkal Avenue, a venue of gallery warehouses, began to slowly come together, then later expand. Away from the international publicity and exposure, Jos Clevers, alongside Hassan Sharif, established a non-for-profit space called the Flying House, a humble 3-storied home that acted as an experimental gallery space and a documentation center for the initial conceptual movement. With the first representation of UAE in 2009 at the Venice Biennial, the dialogue of what contemporary art of the United Arab Emirates is began to mature in the context outside of the private, public, and governmental platforms found locally. Finally, we arrived at, this was last year's Venice Pavilion for the UAE. You have the work of Sarah Al-Haddad, not pointing out favorites, but so you had this sort of, every 2 years you had this representation of what contemporary art looked like. Now what becomes very interesting is up until then there was always a sense of there is no contemporary art in the UAE. There is no sense of contemporary being in the region and let alone the UAE. So through this platform, we were able to kind of have this external voice that was able to reach masses outside of the region. And then, of course, 2017 marks the opening of the Louvre, which here is in its render form. That's the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. And then somewhere around here would be the Zayed National Museum. So from the museums, I would like to kind of re-gear and begin to look at the present moment and understanding the essence of community in this present moment. So the top-down nature of the institutions that now exist in the UAE gave room for artists and art enthusiasts to begin to question the place for grassroots initiatives and the establishment of an in-between sort of experimental space in the United Arab Emirates in the present day. The institutions began acting as tools to help reinstigate grassroots thinking and help to cultivate community through established institutions. For example, you have a platform called UAE Unlimited, which is a satellite platform established by His Highness Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan bin Khalifa Al Nahyan. This commission-based platform gives emerging to mid-career curators a chance to work with emerging and mid-career artists to establish a yearly exhibition rotating between Sharjah, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi. Art Dubai began a program called Campus Art Dubai, which worked with curators and artists separately through monthly meetings, which covered critique and theory, and established a network of the new wave of artists and curators practicing in the United Arab Emirates. In parallel to this, a vital component to the establishment of artists in the UAE is the Sheikha Salama bint Hamdan Foundation, which established a 1-year residency program in collaboration with RISD for artists practicing in the UAE. This program, known as SIF, the Salama bint Hamdan Emerging Artists Fellowship, put artists through a rigorous series of discussion, giving them a space to work and a community to begin to establish. This platform allowed the artists to build an extensive portfolio for their MFAs, thus furthering their careers. Over the years, from cohort to cohort, an interesting movement began to flow and formulate from Abu Dhabi into the wider context of the UAE and the world. To conclude, in a very reminiscent and almost romantic nature, a group of the SIF fellows, along other practicing artists in the UAE, established the first artist-run space in Abu Dhabi called Bait 15. And this natural return to grassroots, individual and introspective narratives of the UAE's current reality has brought the art scene in the UAE back to its original grounded form. The 5 artists, Metha Abdullah, Afra Al-Zahri, Hashil Al-Lamki, Chris Mortenstein, and Tony Bragg have a public exhibition space in the downstairs area and their studio spaces above within Bait 15. This nature of return towards existing outside the establishment is vital to the truth found in the arts of the United Arab Emirates. Like the artists in the 80s, currently in the UAE, a new wave of avant-garde art inspired by its own art history is instigating a new level of art locally, regionally, and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you, Munira, for giving us the bird's eye view of which I can ricochet into the extreme present and a very specific example of some of these endeavors to create an institution that will represent what the landscape and the cultural landscape looks like in the UAE and attempts to influence it across the pan-UAE experience. And before I do that, I'd like to thank His Excellency Zaki Nusayba, Her Excellency Noura Al-Ka'bi for joining us here, and everybody that's joining us tonight, and my co-panelists, and everybody that's part of this event. And it's an extreme, I think, pleasure and also provocation for this project to be situated somewhere in the present. For cinema is, I think, the most pan-durational, non-chronological medium that exists in the illusion of a vessel that represents everything from multiple sentiments to spaces to context to times and experiences, and it's that sort of utopia that has brought me to this moment here today. I usually outsource the explanation of this project to images, and usually the moving image, in this case manually moving images. And I'll walk you through. I'll actually start with one of my favorite quotes by Martin Scorsese, who I'm sure everybody has seen some sort of manifestation of his work. And it kind of really informs the work that, that has gone into his filmmaking, but also his work with the Film Foundation and also the independent cinema sphere and the decision to open an independent cinema at a time where eyeballs are shifting to individual screens. And it goes like this: movies touch our hearts and awaken our vision, change the way we see things. They take us to other places, they open doors in minds. Movies are the memories of our time and our life. We need to keep them alive. And that is the firm sort of manifesto that has really been at the core of the work that we've been doing with Cinema Aqil and an independent, solo, roving, nomadic cinema platform in the UAE. The other coincidence that I would like to kind of just give a nod to is being back here with the Global Art Forum presenting the very project. We've had the pleasure of working with Shimon and the team for the past 2 years as a cinema in residence, taking over the tent at the Fort Island in Medina Jumeirah, presenting themes and cinematic works that are related or in conversation with the themes that the Global Art Forum presents. So it's really great to kind of be able to show the culmination of how that comes to life through the cinema. Okay, so this is sort of our beta test cinema, which I'm going to talk about in terms of figuring out whether a cinema needs to be rooted and bolted down through brick and mortar in a space, or can it exist temporally and ever-changingly? And if I can get this to work. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview. But before I do that, can I just get a show of hands of from our audience here? If you've ever been to a picture house or an everyman theater or a Curzon, can I see hands? Oh, there we go. All right, so this is precisely the kind of reaction that I've been working towards achieving in the UAE space. And over the course of the past 4 years, we've been thrilled to see that that experience is universal, and that excitement and love of cinema as a shared experience exists everywhere. So Cinema Aqid started 4 years ago in 2014 in a very small art gallery, the Third Line Gallery, which was the home of the Farhad Mushiri first exhibits in the UAE, Munir Farmayan, Hassan Hajjaj, and Lamia Gargash, and a lot of important artists that shaped the UAE art landscape that Munira spoke about. We presented a series of 6 weeks, films across 6 weeks from the sort of the whole gamut of what would be considered repertory cinema, Shamon's favorite word, and everything from Dial M for Murder by Alfred Hitchcock, Pather Panchali, from the Apu trilogy, Like Father, Like Son by Hirokazu Koreeda, Pablo Larraín's No, and so on. And we presented these films as a kind of shot in the dark to see whether the UAE had a place and an appetite for independent cinema. And through that presentation, we were kind of ricocheted into the 4-year journey that I'm about to present. As Shamon introduced, this is the first art house cinema in the Gulf, and it seems like a very far-fetched idea, being in a city like London, where every 2 steps, you kind of, confront some sort of art house cinema space. It has celebrated its fourth anniversary this July, and has existed temporally, nomadically, and transiently, jumping from one location to the other in the presentation of these films. In September 2018, which is right around the corner, we will endeavor to have our first outpost to present every day a release slate of independent cinema every single day of the year for audiences in the UAE. We're going to start in Dubai and then, inshallah, spread across the UAE as we always have. So this is what it looks like. We started off as a pop-up cinema, outdoor, indoor, a small space of 4 people sometimes, a room of beanbags, floors, concrete surfaces, and sometimes stadiums like Manarat Saadiyat, which has become our home in Abu Dhabi. The Beta Art House experience, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, was our 2.5-month test run of what an art house cinema would look like in a warehouse in Al Sarkal Avenue in Dubai. And then now going into a permanent home, ticketed with commercial releases every single day. So this is what it looked like. This is the sort of enthusiastic crowd that gave us our needed motivation to continue. In terms of the landscape of the UAE, I mean, the UAE has the biggest penetration, the largest penetration of multiplexes per capita in the region, but not a single dedicated art house repertory screen. There have been multiple experiments, like the Picture House dedicated screen in Dubai, in the Dubai Mall, or in Mall the Emirates had something called DIF 365, which was the Dubai Film Festival sort of year-long space, which has unfortunately now shifted focus and will come back in 2019 in a different form. But this is what it looks like. I mean, there have always been it's penetrated mostly by multiplex, mall-based, blockbuster programmed cinemas. And we are currently trying to kind of time travel into the UAE's historical space of presenting art, standalone, communal, informal way of experiencing cinema. Our programming there's a huge range in terms of what we look to, but really we are at the core of, of what the UAE identity represents. We are, part of the Global South conversation. We seek to present the cinematic traditions that exist in our realm and look at the best of specifically the MENA region's cultural production and cinematic production from every single year. It was mind-blowing to me that it was easier to see a film produced out of Egypt or Lebanon or even sometimes the UAE on a big screen in Paris or in Berlin or in Beirut than to see it in Dubai or to see it in the UAE. So that was something that, that was a gap and an oversight that really needed to be rectified by a space like this, and this is has become a big part of our focus and part of our conversation. Children's cinema, documentary films is a very big part of what we do. Critically acclaimed cinema, award-winning cinema that is part of everybody's contemporary ethos right now. Cult classics, which have informed everybody in our generations and prior to that, and experimental films, which otherwise don't have homes on the big screen. So we've shown everything from films that are Saudi films that have been made only for YouTube consumption on the big screen, and presented them as releases. So we've really had the opportunity to play around with how cinema is presented. This is what it looks like over the past 4 years. We've had 62 pop-ups, which means 62 different programs that have popped up across the country with a total of 50,000 attendees, multiple collaborations with institutions, over 250 shorts, and definitely more than 58 languages. We're also a proud member of the network of Arab Art House Screens, or Arab Alternative Screens. It's a consortium and a network that combines cinemas, that brings together cinemas from Tangier to Khartoum to Beirut, the Metropolis Cinema, and we represent the only cinema in the Gulf, and exchange everything from programming to best practices to audience behaviors and so on. And I'll just show you a few examples of what this temporal cinema that I've been talking about looks like. We pop up at everything from specific events where we program, use the language of cinema and use the medium of cinema to present certain ideas related to specific events. So if there is, for example, the Market Outside the Box, festival, which is a festival that year was focused on sustainability. We presented films that, like Bjork's Biophilia or Werner Herzog's The Wild Blue Yonder, which take a little bit of a lenient view on these thematics and really toys with it. This is Sold DXB down there, which is it's sort of a lifestyle sneaker, hip hop trade event, which has become a space to hack the sort of commercial event to present the history of hip-hop, the language of hip-hop and streetwear, and look at the foundational characters that have shaped these movements. That is, up there is Sikka Art Fair, which is in the Fahidi historical area, where we were able to take over a historical site and turn it into a cinema. So for us, it became a game of every theme, every conversation, every surface becoming a space for a larger view on ourselves through cinema. These are cinema seasons that we put together. So we take over certain spaces like Munira Al Sayegh, where we were invited to put together a season of eight months programs showcasing two films a month. And mind you, these are films that never get released in the UAE oftentimes, or even in the region oftentimes. So it's really a huge responsibility for us to present these films and to speak about them in a way that really allows people to access them and then develop an appetite for further films that have that language. So that's a very important thing to mention. This is Al Sarkal Avenue, which is where our permanent home will be. Cine Concerts is another thing that we've played with, which is reinterpreting scores, like in this case, the Fritz Lang classic Metropolis, which was reinterpreted by an electro-shabby Egyptian band to present it in a very different idea of a public conscience coming to life. Mini film festivals is another thing that we do. Everything from a feminist film festival, which is running right now at Munira Al Sayegh and the A4 space on Al Avenue, titled Fierce, films in the courtyard, which is in the Fahidi Historical District, films at Munira Al Sayegh, which presented films like Killing of a Sacred Deer, A Suitable Girl, Manifesto by Julian Rosenfeld, and so on. And then specifically Arab-focused programs like On Arab Geographies, where we premiered in the UAE films that are unable to access audiences in Egypt. So these are really important moments in our trajectory. And obviously, we try collaborating with different corporate sort of activations to keep our project sustainable. This is the Art House sort of beta version project that I talked about a little bit, which is the test version of an art house cinema. We ran a 2.5-month program every single day in a warehouse where there was nothing bolted to the wall except a single curtain rail. And it became home to 110 seats every single night with releases, with multiple exclusive releases, including the Emirati film Abdullah Al-Kabi's Only Men Go to the Grave, and In the Last Days of the City, Raoul Peck's I Am Not Your Negro, and other important films like that, which would otherwise have only gone to video on demand. So this was a very important kind of role that we tried to take ownership of. And these are some of the titles that I was discussing. So as you can see, the range spans across David Lynch's, Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, to the Kyrgyzstani amazing film Centaur, to films like Maulana and Fire at Sea, which won the Golden Bear, and so on. And finally, I'll just whet your appetite with what we are hoping to bring to life, and what hopefully, if you ever come to the UAE, you'll be able to see, as the first home for art house cinema in the Gulf. This is the warehouse that we're taking over, and this is a 3D render. And obviously, as now we've sort of looked into the utopian imaginations of architectural plans. We're going to endeavor to bring this to life as beautifully and as impeccably as possible. But maybe the impeccable element is what we should rid ourselves of at the same time. So that's a constant conversation in terms of what design elements are going to be part of this space, but this is what it looks like. The real attributes that we're trying to focus on is to be accessible, is to be diverse, and to be informal. A place where people can come together in shared darkness to share an experience, an idea, a travel, and possibly engage or disengage and sit in these ideas together. These are some of our neighbors, and this is the cinema room. So as you can see, it's very atypical of an art house cinema, and almost reminiscent of the original cinemas that were in the UAE in the 70s and 80s. Flat surfaces, an eclectic set of furniture, and those seats that you see here were actually taken from the Golden or Plaza Cinema, which was recently demolished. It was the last standing single standalone cinema in Bar Dubai. And we'll have a small chai diner, which also culinarily kind of throws back to the original cinema experience. Anybody that went to the cinema, in the early 90s or the late 80s will remember the smell of samosas and the whiffs of chai and and these different sensations, along with showcases of scratchy editions of The Little Mermaid. And here we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. I just have two short questions before we move on to our last session and dive in further into the future. The first actually is for you, Butheina, and it relates to your last comment or your last reflection, because it's sometimes said that independent cinemas are an endangered species across the world, but perhaps not evenly across the world. As you rightfully say, London seems to be one of the cinema ecologies where independent cinema is still surviving and quite strongly. And perhaps there are other places in the world where that can't necessarily be the same. And of course, these forces that are kind of gnawing away at independent cinema have been around for a very long time. Of course, it starts with multiplexes, but now we have YouTube, we have Netflix, we have BitTorrent. Our eyes are...
What do you mean?
No comment. I do not advocate illegal downloading of cinema. But yes, you often through your own social media, you've often expressed a kind of melancholy at the destruction of small cinemas from the 70s and 80s in the UAE, but I think also in the wider Gulf, which is also interestingly a kind of one could say the same thing about a certain erasure and destruction of architecture from that period, from the 70s and the 80s. And I know Ahmed and Rashid and Sultan Al-Qasimi. You know, there have been various protagonists who have all been actively advocating for, in a sense, to quote Hans Ulrich quoting Eric Hobsbawm, a protest against forgetting. So to what extent is Cinema Akil a protest against either forgetting or a certain kind of erasure of not just cinema culture, but where architecture and cinema come together to produce certain forms of community, to use Munira's words?
I mean, I think that, I occupy the very, unfortunate space of being hopelessly poetic and romantic about the medium that I operate within, and crassly pragmatic about the means necessary to preserve it. So if you look at the cinematic landscape here in the UK, which is very unique to the way that it exists in the rest of the world, they've been able through different business models and different structures and networks of independent cinemas to preserve the independent cinema as it stands today. Looking at the picture house model, for example, is a very important one in which a sort of a multiplex sort of effect or model is applied to independent standalone cinemas and screens across the country. Day and date releases is another thing. So cinemas opting to release films at the same time they come out on VOD. So there's a lot of different sort of business models and decisions that have to be made in terms of the survival of the actual economics of keeping a cinema alive. But on the more sort of romantic element or the view on the necessary function that a cinema plays, I look to these structures that Ahmed and Rashid presented, that His Excellency Zaki Nusayba talked about, spaces that brought people together. And I think that there's anything that we are fortunate to have in the UAE is a plethora of experiences, a plethora of stories and identities and experiences and religions that need even more spaces to congregate, to share, to sit in darkness and experience their own stories sometimes, and project those stories to other people, experience completely alien ideas and imaginations of different futures, reflect back onto pasts that existed or recollections of our past. So I think that shared communal experience is something that is here to stay. How and what that would look like, I think will have to be informed by the specificity of the context. And in this case, we're building something that is, they're by no means original, but is also, in a way, a Frankenstein cinema or a space that feeds off of successes and attributes that were so beautiful about the country in which we operate. So everything from the spaces to the design. I mean, our design was created by these two independent artists, one from Oman and an Iraqi-Canadian artist that are under the age of 26, and thought about very deeply about Shab Moha and Chindi. And they kind of engaged with the space as an experimentation. How does a space that presents cinematic works of the world in the Gulf operate? And how does it look to previous structures of architectural presence to build something that is now rooted in today? So a lot of these conversations are sort of the the back-end processing modules that kind of help us bring this together. But in essence, it's really bringing people together, bringing those 110 people, 110 eyeballs on every single night into a space where they share this almost transformational experience. Good or bad, you never enter into the space of cinema or the triangle of cinema without coming out of it a changed or influenced individual and conscious. So I think that's what we're trying to really to hone in on.
And just to, my final question before we move on to Noah, and this is to both of you, but I would like to ask you, Munira, first. I mean, I found something very interesting in both of your presentations. There's a question of scales, concrete and abstract. Now, so there are certain forces, globalization, of course, is one, nation building is another, that tend towards certain scales of cultural institution, right? Like they lend themselves to certain iconic forms of visibility, or certain forms of, you could say consumer-led mass experience, Dubai Mall, the cinema situated within Dubai Mall as a certain apogee of where and what cinema culture could mean today in the kind of entertainment complex industry. Now, it can't be a coincidence that you're both advocating for a very different kind of scale of enculturing, of institution building, and that you're both from a younger generation. Could you say something about why would it be fair to say that this kind of bottom-up movement is being led by a younger generation of artists or cinephiles, and is that in opposition to what you feel is has been a dominant narrative so far? Is this something particular to here, or is this something just global? Munira first.
I definitely think that the individual narrative and the individual voice is essential, because in order to sort of arrive at a cultural truth, we need to hear what's going on the ground. Not to say that what's going on the ground is separate to what exists from the top-down structures that are coming through into the UAE, but there needs to be a bridge, there needs to be a link. And with globalization and this idea of existing as an international global human, there's still something that is specific towards us, be it our language, be it our heritage, and the way that we transformed is very particular. The way that you look at the UAE from the 1970s, and you look at our ancestors, and then you look at Butheina and it's there are huge jumps that have taken place socially. And the only time that you can make, in my opinion, these institutions truthful and really give you a sense of experience about the culture and about the place that you are in, is when you begin to incorporate these local grounded voices. And that's something that needs to start from the bottom up. And I feel like within our generation, we look back to the likes of Hassan Sharif and how he had this small house that as long as you had a key, you can enter at any time, and he lives there, so it doesn't matter what time you come in, and just this sense of movement and community and just extending ourselves to cinema and cinema extending itself to us, and for this narrative to really be written by us, from us, by us, and then to the rest of the world. And because naturally the UAE is a global country. It's a very international country and has a very international outlook. But the local and the regional, I think, after that are the two most important things. To develop this network is highly necessary in order for things not to be whitewashed or erased.
Butheina, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I kind of wish it were true to be able to capture this this idea or the impulse to build things like Cinema Aqil in the notion that we're countering or revolting against, hyper-consumerism or the hegemon of hyper-consumerism. And I think there's an element of that, surely. But I think, we are, in the country where there is, we have the Ministry of the Future, and artificial intelligence, but we also are the country that looks to, the sort of the celebration of all that is, slow and all that is kind of contemplative, through contemplative.
Like repertory, impossible to say.
Through the Ministry of Happiness and so on. And all of these things, whether, you call them by those names or by your names, culminate into one singular idea, which is the need to take stock and the need to slow down and the need to reflect. And I think these spaces offer the unique opportunity and the unique platform for these voices to take stock of the trajectory that His Excellency at the beginning of our talks presented to us. How did we get here? What do we look like? Who's sitting on my right and who's sitting on my left? What languages do they speak and what languages do I speak? And I think those spaces are the only spaces in which these opportunities are presented unbiasedly and free-flowingly. And that is my utopian kind of hopeful Kool-Aid kind of infused, take on this. But I think there's a truth to that, and that's I guess why I'm doing what I'm doing personally.
Well, thank you for doing what you do, and Munira, thank you for what you do. Please thank you.